Hi all, I hope all is well. I thought I would take a little bit of time and work through the assignment page for this week. It's a good example of really what's to come, and it builds on what we've been doing because there really, I think, is an art to when you look at it and plan out your week. And unlike many classes where you can sit down, do the readings, get the assignment turned in, and that works really, really well, here, because we have readings, because we have practicing, because we oftentimes have the written assignment, incorporates a bit of both, and that it depends in some ways on having had several days of practice or trying out what you were reading about under your belt in order for the writing to really gel. Having that forward look to the week ahead can be very helpful. So that's what's intended here, whether you're watching this on Sunday afternoon or Monday. And I hope you're able to watch it at the beginning of the week, if not before, so that you have a leg up in terms of not being overly surprised when Wednesday comes. That being said, what I'm really suggesting is that you look at the assignment page as soon as you can after class, and then you plan out when you're going to do what you're going to do that week, so that you don't find yourself stressed or having missed out on something that you could have in a few moments just planned. And of course, this is the case with many things. The judge issues an order and you could wait until a couple days before you know the deadline has been extended to or something. But then you might realize that there were things that if you had read about 2 weeks earlier would have been really, really helpful for your planning purposes. Or maybe even more significant than that, there was a deadline that you didn't realize was built into it. So with that, let us take a look at our assignment page and the different parts that it entails. So the first part is really the readings in the video. This is where you're gathering information. This information might relate to something you're going to try out during the week. It might relate to the practicing that you'll be doing, and it might just be information to take in as we further build the foundation of our understanding of mindfulness, mindfulness practices, settling techniques, and the like. So we've got readings from the textbook. And this week we've got 2 chapters, whereas in the past we've always had 1 chapter and a little bit of readings from the field guide. Here we've got 2 chapters from the textbook. And as I mentioned in class, whereas we're last reading chapter 2 and we could go on to chapter 3 where we'd be learning another practice, mindfulness practice proper, here we're jumping ahead to chapters 6 and chapters 8, where chapter 6 will have us explore an area that to me I've been working on and sharing with others for several years now, which I think you'll find very informative and useful, and it can help enrich your understanding of the mindfulness practices, called solitude. And we talked a little bit about it in class, and you'll get to learn a lot more about it when you read the chapter on solitude, chapter 6. And then there's the chapter on self-care, chapter 8. Now, I used to save the chapter on self-care for later in the semester, and then I realized it's so important to read about, to learn about self-care practices, the importance of self-care, especially within our profession, whether we're studying law, practicing law, and to begin to work with it rather than waiting several weeks and missing the opportunity to do so as part of our practicing. Although it might not be a mindfulness practice, it's a settling technique in many ways, and it can be really important to remind ourselves and reacquaint ourselves with them and begin to work with them. So that's why these 2 chapters are here. And as you'll see, they in some ways might seem to be very different than one another, but they actually fold into one another quite nicely, as they do with mindfulness itself. So you've got those 2 chapters to read. Then you have a reading from the field guide. This is a really, I think, enjoyable piece of a couple pages that you'll enjoy. It's an interview, questions and answers with Maria Konnikova, Life Lessons from the Poker Table. Read it slowly, circle portions that you find interesting, because I'm going to ask you in class, what did you find interesting in the Maria Konnikova interview? There's also a video, so you'll be watching a 30-minute video, part of the Mindful Lawyer podcast, where Christina Sava, who was sitting in your seats about 10 years ago as a student in the mindfulness law class, who went on when she graduated to become a very pivotal part of the Young Lawyers Division of the American Bar Association on integrating mindfulness and wellness to the young lawyers that are part of the ABA, and she has continued in many ways to do that work. She's been practicing law for the tenure as well. So I think you'll find her the conversation to be instructive and her to be inspiring, and she also talks about self-care, so it's pertinent to this week as well in that regard. And then on the class website, you're given a little bit of information to keep in mind as you're reading the various chapters. And that brings us to practice. So the first part is reading or watching and taking in information. And the second part moves into practice, which, as we've talked about, is as important as anything else. So there's two primary types of practices that we've explored thus far. Both ultimately fall into one another, but they look different, they might feel different, they take different amounts of time. We're approaching them from slightly different angles. One is the PMP, the present moment pivot, and the other is the mindfulness practice, the formal sitting down and practicing mindfulness. So you'll see here that both carry forward to this week. They'll carry forward to the end of our semester. That will be a part of every week's class. So for here, it's get down this PMP. And we talked in class how if you were sufficiently motivated, it would happen. So sufficiently motivate yourself. It's 6 seconds a day. It's 6 seconds. I think the thing that is fascinating is that it is so challenging to implement. And that's what I think makes it worth exploring. If it wasn't so difficult to implement, if it wasn't difficult or challenging to sit and do a mindfulness practice for 15 minutes, there probably would be less of a point in doing it, less of a need. So take that as a motivator. And there's also a slight add-on that we're doing to our PMP. And as time passes, we're going to be doing much more fluid shifting around and creative work with our PMP. But if we don't have it down, if we don't naturally stop at certain times to be able to then engage in the PMP, then it doesn't matter what its parts are. We won't be doing it because we'll have forgotten. And that's why this is important. So this week, it's very similar. So you're still going to stop at your present moment pivot point. You're going to settle with a slower, deeper breath. You're going to open by looking around. So that's identical. And we're just adding to the open. You'll then say to yourself, I am here. So again, we're still in the 6 second ballpark. And you might recall that when we did our mindfulness practice in class on Friday, we added that piece, I am here. So that's the PMP. It's still as simple as it gets, but not so easy to implement. So I have faith in you. And then there's the mindfulness practice. And so we're continuing to have the focused attention practice be our primary practice. That will change next week. So this is your last week to really zero in on it. But you'll be learning a new practice that's talked about at the end of the chapter on self-care. And it's called the mindful self-compassion practice. So you'll see here that there are instructions, which is to, and I break it out for you to try to make it simple. And but you could also look at it and go, oh, there's 3 different moving parts here. But there's really not 3 different moving parts. There's just doing your mindfulness practice at least 5 times this week. Once we did it in class. Once will be, if you do a mindful space, your mindful space. And then there's 3 other times that you do when you choose to do them. And so there's practicing the focused attention practice 3 or more times this week. Practicing the mindful self-compassion practice at least once this week. And then practicing the focused attention practice, whether 6 or 12 minutes, by setting a timer and doing it on your own. That is to say, unguided. But you're still doing a focused attention practice. It's the same practice you've been doing. That's why knowing those instructions of what that practice entails is so important. That's why listening to it 5 or 3 or 4 days a week on your own, listening to the guided instruction, now into our 4th week, is downloading and helping you absorb what that instruction is so you can lead yourself. And this is an opportunity to lead yourself by doing it at least once on your own. All right, and that brings us to the writing assignment. So we've just talked about the readings and the video, the downloading of information. We then moved on to the practice, the PMP and the mindfulness practice formally. And now we move to the writing assignment, which in many ways brings together these two, which is why it is that you usually can pull off your writing assignment by reading the chapters and then answering the questions. These are not meant to be tricky or to throw you off or to provide undue stress. They're really to help us integrate an application of what we're reading into an experiential way of relating to it in our life. So here we have it where one page, and as you might recall, and just as a refresher, all assignments are due Wednesday, on or before Wednesday at 8 o'clock. And unless provided otherwise. And if it's otherwise provided on the webpage, then you know. But if it doesn't say anything otherwise, then it's Friday at 8 o'clock. So here you've got 7 questions to answer that draw upon the readings in the different book. And you'll notice that the first one is, what could you try out for the next few weeks that would increase the level of solitude in your day, and how might it prove of value to you? Well, you got to read the chapter on solitaire for that, but the sooner you read that chapter, the sooner you can begin to actually be working with it this week. So in class, I might say, who worked with the solitude. Similarly, if we move down to question number 5, it's what forms of self-care, if any, do you presently engage in on a regular basis, and when do you do so? And then the next one is, you'll see, it moves into the questions around self-care, but it also prompts you to be thinking about what you do or have you been doing in the realm of self-care. So that brings us through the writing assignment, and then you'll put together a one-pager that answers those questions, which takes us now to the reminders. And so at the end of the page, I provide you with things to bear in mind as reminders. So we've got a couple of reminders here. One is about the mindful spaces. When you do a mindful space, you're just moving. It's meant to just take care of you. You go into the room, you sit down, you practice, you're guided, you get up, you leave. You don't need to write anything down in the observations. You don't have to. And when it comes to the type, you're just putting MS for mindful space, and then to draw a box around it, because in a couple of weeks you'll be turning in your field guide and getting another field guide, and that way Yushra can go through and quickly track how many mindful spaces you've done. Also, there's keep in mind the difference between challenges and obstacles and pain and suffering. I could right now go into a discussion of that, but I'm not going to, other than to say challenges are like life happening. 10 people would look at what we would call a challenge, and they would see it very similarly. You're working in the library and somebody next to you is talking on their phone. That could be challenging situation. 10 people would all say, there's a person sitting next to me on their phone. The obstacle is, are we feeling annoyed? Are we feeling compassionate? Are we feeling frustrated? Are we feeling angry? This is the obstacle. The obstacle tends to be, it is internal. The challenge tends to be external. Most people would see the challenge the same way, and many people would have different obstacles arise, if any, in relationship to that challenge. So we want to begin to notice as things are happening and we get sort of frustrated and we resist, to use a term from our mindful living flow, we are interested in beginning to notice, this is a challenging situation because of this event that took place, and these are the obstacles that are arising within me in response to it, because our mindfulness practice and cultivating greater mindfulness is really in the spirit of noticing more of the internal, which we oftentimes under-realize at the expense of over-realizing and pointing the finger to things that are happening around us. And then there's pain and suffering, that reminder that S, suffering, equals P, pain, times resistance. And I could ask you, what's the relationship between challenges and obstacles and pain and suffering? And there's a very tight relationship. So maybe we'll talk about that in class. All right, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or Yushra. Wishing you a really terrific week. Looking forward to seeing you on Friday.